Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in. In this video, I am going to chat about the new Teravail Washburn semi-slick tire. So if you don't know, Washburn is a town in northern Wisconsin that actually sits on Lake Superior. And this tire was named after that specific town and the gravel surrounding Washburn, Wisconsin. So what is in a semi-slick tire? So full disclosure, this is the first time I've actually run a semi-slick tire on any of my bikes, and it worked really well for the recent trip I did in Minnesota. Semi-slick tires are great for being able to ride gravel, but they also perform really well on pavement. As you see in this tire, it's got a slick center profile, and then on the side, you've got transition lugs and then side lugs. So all of the tires come in 60 TPI. There's a 700 and a 650 size. The 700 comes in 38 and 42 millimeter sizes, and the 650B comes in 650 by 47 millimeters. So a little bit of a bigger volume tire to compensate for that smaller wheel size. The tires also come in two different casing options. So you have the durable, which is bead to bead durable casing. So essentially it protects not only the sidewall, but it has an additional layer of protection on top of the tire as well. And then it also comes in a light and supple casing. Both options come in tan and black sidewalls. So I tested the 700 by 42 light and supple tires, and I installed them tubeless. It was super easy. I used a regular floor pump and they seated properly. So I mounted them up to the Industry 9 Ultralight 240C rims. After doing so, I measured them up and the tire came out to just over 42 millimeters, right on par with their measurements. So I forgot to weigh the tires before I actually installed them because I was in a rush. But I ended up taking off the front tire, cleaned out the tire, cleaned out the sealant, and dried up the tire, and it came out to 484 grams. I feel like it's very difficult or challenging to achieve a supple ride quality with a high PSI tire and in a 700 range. So 650, it's much more attainable because you can run lower tire pressures because you have more volume. With a 700 by 42, you have a little bit more leeway than say a 38. But the problem is with a bike packing rig, with a loaded rig, you really want to ensure that you have enough tire pressure so that you don't pinch your tire or you don't bottom out the tire. So in this case, I typically run a 50 rear and a 45 front. With 42 millimeter tires at 700, you could probably run a little bit lower, but I stuck with that because I had a very heavy bike. That being said, I am 150 pounds, so I probably can run lower pressures, but I just want to be a little bit more cautious. I tested these tires for just under 1,000 miles. 650 of those miles were on a bike packing trip from Iowa to the Canadian border in Minnesota. It was a 62% gravel heavy trip. This center slick was a great option for that specific route because I was riding on so much pavement, and the gravel in Minnesota is relatively smooth. There are some chunky sections, but for the most part, it almost feels like pavement. Some of the off-road terrain that I pedaled on was 2-track, single track. I definitely did a little bit of under biking, so this was definitely a little bit of an under tiring. Is that a thing? So overall, it was a great tire for this specific route because, well, it has that gravel quality, yet it is super fast. I didn't ever feel any rolling resistance when I was riding on pavement. So just talking about the tire's profile a little bit. So obviously we've got this center slick, which is probably, I'd say, a 1/2 inch in width, and it works really well when you're on pavement. But then these transition lugs, if you corner a little bit, it almost creates the illusion, because these lugs are spaced so tightly together, that you are still on that center slick. So the transition from the center slick to those transition lugs is super natural, and you can't really tell that you're on a knobby tire or on that transition lug when you do turn the tire over. And I know a few people were concerned about the abrupt move from center slick to the transition lug, but I think because the transition lugs are so tightly spaced together, I don't see any abnormal wear and tear on the tire. I'm not gonna lie, Right away, when I was getting on gravel, the first 100 or so miles, I was a little mentally scared to turn the tire on its side. And I think that's due to the fact that it is a center slick, and I was worried that the tire wouldn't actually hook up in gravel. After a few hundred miles, that was no longer a concern. I just had to get used to the tire. In fact, when I did turn the tire over, these transition lugs do actually do a great job of kind of hooking into gravel or crushed limestone. So in a few instances when testing the limits of these tires between the transition lug and the side lug, you could definitely feel an instability when rolling beyond that transition lug. And so it would wash out a little bit. Mind you, this is when I'm actually testing the limits of these tires on purpose. So it would catch sometimes, but other times it wouldn't. There's this point in between the transition and the side lugs where there's really not much going on in the tire. You've got these diamond-shaped lugs that pop up. They definitely can conform to the gravel, but it seems like this is the tire's biggest fault. And my thoughts on side lugs in general, once you're on these side lugs, especially the far ones, you're probably going to be on your side anyways. So they're not necessarily as important as, say, your transition lugs. So just talking about maybe some rougher gravel terrain, I went over a bunch of roads that were recently graded, farm roads that were recently graded, so they're really loose. The center slick doesn't necessarily hook up very well in loose rock or recently graded roads. Rightfully so, you know, it's a center slick. So I used these tires commuting around the city, and they performed very similar to my bike packing experience. Obviously they roll super well on pavement. And then when I find some gravel here and there, or if I want to ride some single track briefly around the city, they can do that. Sure, more underbiking, but it's capable of much more than you would think. So I did take these tires on quite a bit of crushed limestone and rail trail. The tires hooked up really well in that really small granular pebble. But one thing I do want to mention is I had some friends behind me that kept getting annoyed of those rocks kind of coming up and hitting them in the face or on the cheek. And that's because these transition lugs, they're tight enough together where they can kind of stick a little pebble in and they fling out after you run over them. That being said, being behind a person in a gravel peloton with Gravel Kings is extremely scary. So these are not nearly as bad as that, but it does occur from time to time. So overall, the Teravail Washburn, it performed as expected. The center slick rolled as well as you would hope. No rolling resistance and fast. The transition lugs hooked up extremely well on gravel, but they also rolled super well cornering on pavement. You can't even feel that you're on those transition lugs when you're riding on tarmac. And yes, there might be an issue between the transition and the side lug, but there's a ton of tires that have that exact same issue, especially when you're trying to maneuver quickly or corner at slower speeds. Over 900 miles on this tire, it really isn't showing a drastic wear, especially on the center or the transition lugs. We do see a little bit more wear and a bit of chunk from the side lugs kind of coming out of the tire. And that just kind of goes to show the strengths and weaknesses of this specific tire. I guess my question is, do you like what you see with the center slick tire or this specific tire? The Washburn seems like it's one of the more aggressive center slick tires out there. It's got a very narrow center slick itself with beefier transition and side lugs. But what do you think? I had a thought the other day. I was like, why not see a tire like this in the 29er by 2.2 inch category? It would work extremely well, especially for a route like the Great Divide mountain bike route. So why not adapt this idea with a very narrow center slick to transition lugs that work really well on both pavement and gravel to more beefy side lugs that will hook up when you are riding single track or chunky 2-track fleece or ridge, you know? Why not see a tire like this? I understand the challenge of making that center slick transition into the transition lug. And that is the biggest challenge, I think, that tire engineers have. But this is the right step for that, in my opinion. So what do you think? Let us know in the comment section below. And let me know if you have any comments or questions on the Washburn specifically. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, pedal further.